So Superstorm Sandy was really a wake-up call to the Northeast. It's the largest recorded hurricane in human history. Most hurricanes are 300 miles long. This was 1,000 miles long. What made it a superstorm is it ran into a nor'easter, which is why it suddenly veered west to hit New York and New Jersey. Where it made landfall, it wreaked havoc with our transportation systems, electrical grid, our residential areas. But meanwhile, this is what it looked like in Boston the day of Superstorm Sandy, which is not so different from the king tides we saw 3 different times this year. This is what today's high tide plus 2.5 feet looks like in Boston. So why do we flood? Before I started working on this research, I thought, oh, my poor theoretical grandchildren, what they'll have to deal with when that spigot turns on. You know, my magical thinking was, this is not a problem for 100 years. Really, this is a probability issue. So basically, do you have a storm surge? And in Boston, Boston Harbor is very protective. Our average storm surge is 2 to 3 feet. Our 1 in 100 chance storm surge is 5 feet. Our 1 in 1,000 chance in a given year storm surge is only 6 feet, and that's really our asymptote. We don't get much more than that. But storm surges happen when a storm comes from the east and pushes water westward, and so we get some flooding from that. But then if that happens at a wicked high tide, which of course is a scientific term used locally, which is when the sun and the moon align during full and new moons. Remember vector geometry, it pulls in the same direction. That'll give us about another foot of higher seas. And then a king tide is when that happens when the moon is closest to us in its orbit. And that'll give us about 2.5 feet. So these are additive. And then finally, underlying sea level rise. And what I think about this is, imagine a kid in a bathtub. So if you have a predictably tantrumy child, you will potentially be flood prepared and only put a little bit of water in that bathtub. If you have a relentlessly calm child, you can fill up that bathtub. But if you have a mistakenly full bathtub and a unpredictably tantrumy child, you will have coastal flooding, right? So basically, sea level rise or coastal flooding is about the higher the underlying sea level, the smaller the storm it takes to overtop our coastal infrastructure. So let's look at storm surges first. So Boston and New York are about 200 miles as the crow flies, but we're very different in topography, and to be partisan, we're far better. So Boston, to our east, has Stellwagen Bank. It's an underwater mountain range. If you ever go whale watching, that's where the whales hang out because it's extraordinarily rich ecosystem. Then you get to Boston Harbor proper. There's peninsulas guarding the mouth of it. Poor Winthrop and Hull get most of our storms. And then 34 harbor islands. So by the time a 30-foot wave, which is our 1% chance a year wave, enters Boston Harbor, by the time it hits the aquarium, it's a 2-foot wave. So and plus it's a very round harbor. So we have extraordinary topographical defenses, natural defenses. Unlike New York is to the west of Long Island, so a whole bunch of that nor'easter or storm surge coming from the east, which is where our storms come from. Half of it goes north of Long Island Sound, down the East River. The other half comes south of Long Island, up New York Harbor, which is narrow, has almost no islands, and there's nowhere for that water to go but up. So for the same size storm, they call it a 100-year storm. We can't call it that anymore because our external environment's no longer static. But a 1% chance storm, our 1,000-year storm is almost 2 feet lower than New York's 100-year storm. And as you can see, the stronger the storm, we really flatten out at about 6 feet of storm surge. New York just keeps going up. So because of our topography, we have very different outcomes. Let's then look at how that relates to tides. This is from this fall's king tide. So as you can see, this is a completely flat, high-pressure day. So there's no wind, no atmospheric addition. This is where GE plans to put its world headquarters, right? So this is just an extra high tide astronomically. But mid-century, this will be a normal high tide. This is the Dorchester Harbor Walk. Notice the bench. The Harbor Walk near the Children's Museum. None of these, people weren't stupid when they put our infrastructure this way. The sea was just lower. We've already seen more than a foot of sea level rise between building this infrastructure and what we have today. So this is Long Wharf, which is obviously at sea level. This is our road salt up Chelsea Creek. A seaside restaurant in the sea. I quote unquote dry dock in Charlestown Navy Yard. So, we take pictures of these king tides because it really predicts what tides will be starting about mid-century. So let's look at how tide and storms combine. This is the Coast Guard station in Lower Manhattan. This is what it saw during Superstorm Sandy. The lowest curve at the bottom is the astronomical tide cycle. We get 2 high tides a day. The middle curve is the storm surge, and a storm tide is tide plus surge equals storm tide. So the day of Sandy, unfortunately, that storm surge hit at high tide, so they had 14 feet above low tide, and so that is something you just don't prepare for. This is our Coast Guard station near the Children's Museum. The first thing you can see is that our tide cycle is a 10-foot tide cycle instead of New York's, which is a 4-foot tide cycle. Remember that our highest storm surge is 6 feet, so only if we get a storm surge at high tide, above mid-tide, do we even care. And of course, ours came closer to low tide, or we would have noticed. Had Superstorm Sandy hit at high tide, we would have had what we call a 100-year coastal flood, but we missed that by 5.5 hours. The last time we had a 100-year flood was Blizzard 78, and before that in the 1800s. So until climate change started changing things, they really were 100-year floods. So the real problem is underlying sea level rise, and the differences in the colors here, the light blue predictions are really deeply carbon constrained global emissions. So that's really car to bicycle, elevator to stairs. If you get to kind of moderate to business as normal, you can get as much as 1.5 feet by mid-century. That's pretty much locked in at this point. But up to 7.5 feet as really a probable, given business as usual. And these numbers keep going up over time as the science and modeling get better. Why does 7.5 feet matter in Boston? Because that's the point at which all of our filled tidelands flood tidally. So 1/3 of Boston was filled in from estuaries and would flood at high tide at 7.5 feet of sea level rise. So this is today's high tide plus 2.5 feet barely floods. This is a map from a hydrodynamic model that says what's the likelihood of flooding with a 5-foot storm surge? It takes into account that those storm surges don't always hit at high tide. So you get a little bit of flooding. That same storm at mid-century floods quite a bit more of Boston. So what starts to flood? We call this now the Innovation District. We've been dubbing it the Inundation District because it's one of the first places to flood in Boston. Bayside Expo, which UMass Boston just bought for new housing. If you use a Gillette razor, that was made in Fort Point Channel, that floods. The Constitution doesn't flood, but the Charlestown Navy Yard does. And if you go to in between Faneuil Hall and City Hall, you'll see this little inscription on the ground of the original shoreline. And high tide plus 5 feet of flooding will get you all the way back to Dock Square, which of course used to have a dock on it. By 2070, we'll look at this kind of flood during a major flood event, and this is closer to 30% of the city. This starts to get into our commerce. So Logan Airport is flooded by then. Conley Cargo Terminal, the downtown wharves and our neighborhoods start to flood at today's high tide plus about 7.5 feet. So why do these floods, why does this look like this? This is just a bathtub model, much less complex than the hydrodynamic maps that you just saw. This is really what would flood for whatever reason if there were 7.5 feet of more water in Boston. Why this map looks the way it does, I'm going to overlay the map of 1775. Right? So these are all our estuaries and shallow bays that we filled in over the last 240 years to make more elbow room. I'm just going to do that one more time. So our design challenge is sometime between now and 240 years from now, our coastline will go back to its original topography. So a real design challenge that we're going to talk about tonight is, what do you do between now and then? Because we're the Boston Harbor now, I know a whole lot more about coastal flooding, but just a couple trends. Rainfall trends, they're not as linear as sea level rise because they're really an interaction between rainfall intensity and where it can go. So we're the part of the country where rainfall is getting much more intense. We're getting more flash floods. We're also getting more flash droughts, like we saw last summer. So our rainfall is just getting more bursty, and that our infrastructure is really not prepared for this higher intensity of volume of water. So here's an example from a no-name storm in Framingham. Who remembers this storm? And yet it flooded Framingham badly. Who remembers this storm in Fall River? And yet it ruined the stormwater infrastructure. So particularly our secondary cities, even our primary cities like Boston and Cambridge, don't have the infrastructure, nor necessarily do they have either the funding or the room under their roads to increase forever our storm drain system. So we need to do a lot more opportunities for water to soak in and either be stored or slow down the amount of water hitting our infrastructure. And the other piece is, of course, heat. Until recently, we would have 11 days per summer that were above 90 degrees. Last summer, we had 22 days, so twice as much as normal. By 2070, the prediction is that all summer long will be above 90 degrees, with half of that even above 95 or even 100 degrees. So we're looking at, right now we're probably closer to New Jersey, by mid-century being closer to Baltimore, and by the end of the century being closer to Birmingham in terms of our climate. So laying the groundwork for this discussion, there are absolutely many things we can do in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Typically, I put in more good news at the end of
Who's
my
Dr.
presentation.
Doom now?
I'm just Ms. Doom. So if you want to hear the good news, you'll have to ask for a fuller presentation. But thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay.